So we are starting today with May, June 2024, paper 11. That's paper 1. 11, right, stands for paper 1, variant 1. So that's where the 11 comes from. You can see paper 1 reading. We've already practiced the specimen. Now, as I have suggested to you guys, right, we are not going to take a look at any of the questions. Right, so the question paper is right here. We'll come to that later. The first thing I want you to do is read the text. So we're going to read text A. And all the more reason, right? So we recently had our midterm examinations, and I checked, I do teach at school. So I checked papers, and I discussed the results and the paper itself today with my students. And they didn't do all that well in their comprehension, right? Now, one reason, among others, is because they didn't read the comprehension before attempting the questions. They read the questions and they read that part of the comprehension trying to find the answer. Right now, that could possibly, I'm not saying that you absolutely have to, but the thing is, when you read the text before looking at the questions at all, like, just don't bother looking at the question paper, just read the text first. And that really helps you understand what the text is talking about, and it familiarizes your brain with uh, the content of the text. So when you read the questions, then you read all the questions as I've explained, right, in our earlier classes. You read all the questions from start to end, or at least all the questions under question one, right? So comprehension is now split between question one. So you've got sub questions A to H, I believe, right? And then, yeah, A to H, and then you've got question two. So at least read all the sub questions under question one before attempting anything. Right, and so when your brain is familiar with the kind of words and the phrasings and the content in general and what's going on, and so when you're going back and you're reading the text again to find the answers, your brain will be able to process it much better, and so you'll get better results, hopefully. Right, and if you have decent reading speed, if you can't figure it out the first time, read it a second time. Right, read it a second time and then go to the questions. Right, of course you are limited by time in a paper, so that is an issue, but yeah. So here's the text. I'm putting it on screen, and obviously it's only part of it, so we have it going all the way up till here. And right, tell me when you guys want to scroll. So it's titled The Not Shore. The writer is attempting to navigate his way alone in a canoe across northern Canada's mainland Arctic. At this point in the story, he's traveling the length of a huge lake. Right, so starting from paragraph 1, there you have it on screen. And just let me know when you're done with this part, so I'll scroll further. All right, should I scroll down a paragraph or two?
No.
All right, I'm scrolling a bit. So yeah, I'll keep it here. That's the end of this page. You've got paragraph 6 and 7 to read, and then we can move on to the next page. All right, now scrolling over to the next page. Right, that is the remainder of the text, all on screen. So just get through with that in next few minutes, and so we can move towards the questions. All right, now that we're done reading, I'll just scroll back to the top of the text. And now let's take a look at the questions. So what I want you to do first is read all the sub questions under question 1, right? So just take a look at those. I'll be scrolling along. All right. So now that we've taken a look at the questions under question 1, the sub questions, right? Just to once again highlight the question types and your general approach to these. Some of these questions are explicit meaning questions, which are the type that the answer is clearly given in the text, right? So all you need to do is look at the text, find the answer, and put in. For example, right, question A. Give one reason why it was difficult for the writer to paddle his canoe in the icy water. That reason is clearly given in the text. You need to find it, write it down. The other type of question is the implicit meaning. One of those is using your own words, right? So in this case, they've given you a phrase. And so basically what you need to do is figure out synonyms for faintly and tracing that fit into the context of the given passage, right? What's happening in the passage. So it's not just synonyms that you take out of the text of the dictionary, right? It's a contextually suitable synonym, and then you write those down. And to be very, very, obvious about it, the best thing is you make a sentence out of it. But what you can do is it's worth 2 marks. And again, the approach, the Cambridge approach, is 1 valid point per mark. And so you've got 2 keywords over here, and rephrasing each of those is 1 mark. So that's a total of 2. And so what you can do to make it simple and clear, you write down faintly followed by a colon, and then write down whatever synonym you've thought of to rephrase it. Similarly, for tracing, you write down tracing, a colon, and then whatever synonym you've figured out to rephrase it. So that makes it easy. The third question, right, is a mix of implicit and explicit, right? So they're telling you to identify one feature. So that feature is clearly given in the text. And then they're asking you to explain the reason why it made it difficult, right? So this explanation could be explicit or implicit. We'll take a look at the text for this question, right? The explanation might be given in the text, or they might be asking you to think about it, to sort of digest the text and come up with an explanation on your own, right? The explanation obviously should fit into the context of the passage, of what's happening in this, right, in passage A or text A, or whatever you want to call it. Another implicit type question. So again, this is explicit, right? Give 2 things that the writer did. So that's clearly from the passage, from the text. Explain what the writer was thinking, right? So this thinking is not given. So this is clearly an implicit meaning question. So you have to read the part of the text where this is given. They've given you the phrase "just a little longer, my old friend," and that's line 13. So line 13 is telling you where the phrase is taken from, not where you'll find the answer. Keep that in mind, right? The line references that they give you, for example, line 4 over here is where they've taken the faintly tracing from. It is not where you'll find the answer. It's an implicit meaning question anyway. So the answer is not given directly in the text, right? And so we go and look around line 13 to understand what's going on and to get a sense of what the writer was thinking when he, for which he wrote down this words, he or she, whomever it is. And then we write it out. So this is an implicit meaning question, right? The answer is not clearly stated in the insert. Paragraph 4, again, is a mix of implicit and explicit meanings, right? Question F, sorry, not paragraph 4. How did the writer feel about the weather? That feeling is not given, right? That feeling is something that you have to figure out. It's an implicit meaning question. That's worth 1 mark. So it's a total of 3. How do I know it's worth 1 mark? Because the question is saying give 2 details from the text to support your answer. So 2 details, each detail worth 1 mark. So that's 2 marks. And so the feeling itself is worth 1 mark. Okay. The details are given from the text. So that's explicit. So you just need to go and find something the writer says about the weather. Right now, what you can do is you can work with this question the other way around. Right. What you do is you go to paragraph 4. You first find 2 details that are talking about the weather, right? You note them down, or before noting them down, at least you mark them in your paper, right? And then you look at them and you say, okay, fine. So what is the writer feeling? You figure that out. And once you figure that out, then you write the feeling, and then you write the supporting details from the text, right? So this is a mix of explicit and implicit. Question G part 1 and 2 are both explicit meaning questions, and then question H is again a mix of explicit and implicit because they're asking you about the writer's feelings about the place where he decided to make camp. The writer's feelings are not given directly, and they're also asking you to use your own words. So since it's not given directly, obviously you'll be using your own words to come up with a feeling, and they're also asking you to give details. So for right, what you need to do over here is give three feelings, right? Because they're asking different feelings. So what you need to give three feelings, each feeling supported by a piece of text, right? So this is the text I read, which tells me the writer is feeling this way, and that combination of text, which is explicit meaning, along with the feeling that you figured out, which is implicit meaning, for this question, that combination will get you 1 mark. So you need three pieces of text along with three feelings, and that will get you your 3 marks, right? So that's the combination. Okay. And right, so that also goes for our strategy to attempt this. Also, right, we are not touching on question 2 right now, but somewhere halfway, maybe paragraph 7, okay, well, not exactly half, but like somewhere along the passage, it sort of splits off. Maybe paragraph 7, maybe paragraph 8, right? We'll take a look at it. And so question 1 is not from the whole thing, it's up till paragraph 6 or something, right? The rest of the text is for question 2, which brings in the writer craft questions, right? So it's the same text is not used again for the set of questions that will come in in question 2, right? Also, right, why did I ask you to read all the questions first, at least the sub questions under question 1, so that you know what each question is asking, and so that you don't have an overlap in your answers, because 99 point, well, forget a point, right? I'll give a generous margin. 99% of the time, Cambridge answers do not overlap. They do not overlap, right? So if you're seeing you're writing the same answer for two different questions, one of your answers is incorrect, right? Mhm. That is most likely the case. So know what each question is asking, to what extent it is asking it, and then attempt it accordingly. Okay. Now, getting to solving this. Question 1A, in paragraph 1, give one reason why it was difficult for the writer to paddle his canoe in the icy water. So let's go back. Here's paragraph 1, just those 2 lines, right? And tell me why it was difficult for him to paddle his canoe.
Because of the wind.
Because of the wind. Now, just saying the wind is not enough. What property did the wind have? Okay, a response I have, the fierce wind. Anyone else? Strong winds. Right, Amarza? Same?
Yes,
Yes. Okay. Mustafa, are you there still? Right. And you agree with the other responses that we're getting? Strong winds and fierce winds? Okay. So that would be correct. This is obviously very simple and straightforward, right? So you get your 1 mark. Now, Haram, you just said because of the wind, right? And just saying wind is not enough, right? That's why I ask you what property of wind. right? It says fierce wind. You could say strong wind. You could say gust of wind. So any of those would work, right? Because a gust is also, right, a strongly blowing wind, right? So either of those would work, but just saying because of the wind is not enough. Okay, next question. And we're immediately thrown into using your own words, right? So using your own words, explain what the text means by faintly tracing. So that's line 4, right? And line 4 is over here. So ahead on the North Shore, the one I'd been faintly tracing in my canoe for many inhospitable kilometers, right? So we have it over there. You can read that part maybe a bit ahead. We have already read paragraph 1 again. So you understand the context now. Think of synonyms for each word over here, faintly and tracing, and then let me know what you come up. Now, obviously, you have the option of Googling it. I would not suggest it, right? Technically, you could, but yeah, right? See if you can fit it in. I'm not suggesting it because this is obviously a test of your English vocabulary skills as well, right? All right, so I have one response, vaguely tracking or vaguely outlining. Anyone else?
Slowly following.
Slowly following, slightly tracing. Okay, so let's do faintly first, right? It's not slowly, so slowly would be incorrect, right? It's barely or unclearly, right? And so vaguely might work. Now, keep in mind for this type of question, if you take a look at the mark scheme, they'll give you a few options. If you use a word that is not given in the mark scheme, that does not necessarily mean that it's incorrect in such a case, because the examiner will then discuss it with their supervisors and whatever the hierarchy is, and they'll see whether that synonym fits into the context, right? And you may or may not get a mark. Now, if you're at school and the teacher says, well, no, it's not according to the mark scheme, you can't really blame the teacher, because this is a hit or miss, right? If this teacher says, oh, well, I'll allow it, right? We don't really know what the examiner is going to do. So the teacher is sort of bound by what's given in the mark scheme. The actual mark scheme that an examiner has is much more extensive. And I'm not an examiner. The reason I know it is because I've taken the Cambridge training, and our facilitator was also an examiner, and they've shared that bit with us. So yeah, so vaguely might work, but right, it's not one of the suggested answers. So generally or barely or unclearly goes for faintly, so not slowly. And then for tracing, following works. Sorry, uh, what was it again? Yeah, tracing. So Mirza, see, the problem with your response is you've only tried to rephrase faintly, right? You use tracing again. If you're reusing the same word, or if you're reusing a derivative of that word, right? So tracing, traced, uh, with a d at the end, right? So past tense, or traces, or something like that, right? Some derivative of trace, it still won't count, right? So for example, following, follows, followed, right? That won't. I mean, following is not given over here. I'm just giving an example of derivatives. So if you're using the same word or some derivative of that word, it won't count, right? So right, for tracing we have got following. So following works, tracking works, traveling along works, right? So Afin, you wrote tracking, that works. Following works, tracing, no. Slightly, no. Okay, not discovering, right? He's not discovering. He's because he mentions it later, but he has a map and all that, right? So he's not discovering it. He's following along that shoreline. Acha, another thing, uh, Afin, you gave two options as your response, right? You mentioned what was it again? Vaguely tracking and vaguely outlining. In your response, in your response, do not do do not give two answers, right? You don't write vaguely tracking or vaguely outlining, because the examiner is not going to check both of them, right? The examiner will just look at your first response, whether it's correct or incorrect doesn't matter, right? You either get the mark or you don't, and then right will ignore the second part, or they just might cancel the whole thing, right? Because they'll like the student doesn't know what the answer should be, so they're giving more than one response, and so they'll just cancel, they'll cut out the whole thing, they won't award you any marks even if one of those two are correct. So do not put slashes, do not put or and, or give multiple responses for one answer, right? Just in your mind decide what you want and write down one answer for one question. Okay. Even right, this even applies to the summary and dieted writing and composition, where students tend to put a slash or and they give multiple options of vocabulary, like the words they want to use in that same scenario. Don't do that, because that reduces the quality of your writing, and in case of comprehension questions or even summaries, right, that just there's a chance that you'll just lose the mark entirely. Okay. Mustafa, you say tracing can be memorization too. What do you mean by that? What does this have to do with memorization? Keeping in mind. So how does that fit? I'm sorry, like I don't follow. If you could explain that to me. Hmm. All right, you could, we could continue. You could message me later if you like want to discuss that further. I'm still not clear on what you meant by that. Okay. Question C. From paragraph 2, identify one feature of the North Shore that made it difficult to find a place to camp there. Explain the reason why this feature made it difficult to camp, right? So again, the feature is obviously an explicit meaning question, just find it. Let's see if the explanation is there or we have to figure it out on our own. All right, so this is paragraph 2, somewhere over here. All right. Uh, so the feature one, right, I've got one response from Afin. The feature is cold Arctic winds, and the explanation is the tent wouldn't stay anchored for long. Do I have any other responses? Right. Cold Arctic wind tent can't last long unanchored. Aram, Mariza, Mustafa?
Sir, I have same answer.
Same answer. Right. So uh, Afin has a question, right? She explained the feature of cold Arctic winds by saying the tent wouldn't stay anchored for long. And her question is, can she use the same wording as in the text, right? Because the text also says uh, that the Arctic wind, no tent could last long unanchored. So this just comes down to whether it's an explicit or implicit meaning question. Now, in this case, what we can see is that the feature, right, the strong Arctic winds, right, and then uh, let me take a look at the question again, right? So one feature of the North Shore that made it difficult to camp there. So what was the feature and explanation basically meaning why? So the feature was the difficulty in setting up tent over there were the Arctic winds, and that, right, a tent could not last there unanchored. So if it's an explicit meaning question where you are getting the information for the answer from the text, then you can copy it directly. There's no issue, right? There used to be a time in the older syllabi where even if the student is it's an explicit meaning question and it's given in the text, they would not allow lifting of the lines. Lifting of the lines means directly copying the lines from the text as the answer. That's no longer the case. So if it's explicit meaning, if the answer is clearly given, then you can use those same words as your response to the question. If it's an implicit meaning question, then right, obviously they expect you to write it on your own, right? In that case, right, it's just more like the main question where the wording really plays a role are the ones which ask you to use your own words, right? So we've come across one of those. We've got one or two coming up later as well. And so using your own word questions are the ones where you do not want to reuse the words that are either given in the phrase, in the question, or anywhere in the text. So question H, I believe, right, doesn't end. Is it the same with F? Right, so perhaps with F as well, right? But in question H, they're asking you to use your own words to come up with the writer's feelings. Now, right, this is an implicit meaning question. The writer's feelings are not clearly given, but if you find any hint from the text, you don't want to be reusing that same word, right? Particularly in questions that are asking you to use your own words. Does that satisfactorily answer your question, Afin? Okay. Uh, right. So cold Arctic wind and right. So the responses we've got are all pretty much the same. The cold Arctic winds and the tent could not last unanchored. Right. There's another suggested answer for this, and that is The feature that made it difficult to camp over there is the tiny patch of grass or the piles of ancient rock. Now you'd say, well, those are two different things. Yes, but then sometimes what Cambridge does is it sort of clumps points together, right? So there's a patch of tiny grass, right? And the fact that it's a tiny patch, so a tiny, not a patch of tiny grass, a tiny patch of grass, right? So the fact that it's very small would make it, difficult to set up tent, right? It would not permit the tent to be pitched, right? So again, right, that explanation is given along with the reason, the feature, sorry, and right between the vast heaps of ancient boulders. So perhaps that's the reason why they've clumped it together, either saying a tiny patch of grass or the heaps of ancient boulders. Both of these, right, would not permit the tent to be pitched. Right, they've also mentioned the strong wind over here, a bit metaphorically, blasted by the frosts of 100 million winters. So that's basically referring to the strong Arctic wind. But they've also mentioned that very clearly again later. So that's a separate point. So again, right, when Cambridge clumps different points together as a single point, that's not something we can anticipate. That's not something we can sort of guess. So what our job is to answer as fully as possible and hope for the best, right? Okay, so right, since we had new participants, I spent a bit more time in going over some of my early explanations again as to how to attempt these. I'll stop here since we are just about out of time, and we'll continue from here tomorrow. So hopefully, or certainly, we should be able to complete all of question 1 and perhaps delve into question 2 as well. Any questions before we end? Anything to clarify, or any opinion you want to voice? Something?
No.
All right then. I'll see you guys next class, inshallah.
Class.
Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz. Right, Mustafa. Tracing is tracking is keeping in mind. Okay, tracing is tracking. So tracking is one of the suggested responses given in the mark scheme, right? And so, right, the next part that you're saying, tracking means keeping in mind as in follow, right? So let me just go back over there, right? Following is one of the suggested answers, right? So if you said following, that would work. Did you say following for this one? Right, you said noticing it slightly. That's what you wrote earlier on when we were discussing the answers to this question. And so I said noticing it slightly doesn't fit in at all. Okay, so that was for faintly. Well, in that case, right, so a bit of misunderstanding on my part and a bit of confusion in the way you wrote it. It was a bit confusing, I guess, for me. But that still doesn't work for faintly, right? So noticing it slightly, again, right? If the examiner allows it, that's on the examiner. I can't say whether it will work or not, right? You may or may not get a mark for it. In this case, because it's not a suggested response in the mark scheme, I'd say no, right? As for tracing, yes, tracking or following would work. Okay, anything else? I'll take that as a no. All right, so once again, see you guys next class. Allah Hafiz.